Ted Cruz is our guest. Tomorrow, Wednesday, July 1st, from 10:30 to 1:30, he will be at the Sam's Club on Rice Avenue. That is southwest, just southwest of 610. From 3 to 5 tomorrow, he will be in Katy at the Books A Million. On Thursday, for our Dallas-Fort Worth listeners, he will be in Arlington from 10 to noon at the Costco on Arbrook Boulevard, and he'll be in Waxahachie from 4 to 6 on Thursday at the Hastings Bookstore. And for our Atlanta listeners, he will be in Georgia on Friday and Sunday at a number of different stops, and then going on from there to Iowa. But since we don't have an affiliate in Iowa, we're not telling you about that. Senator Ted Cruz, thanks for being our guest, buddy.
Michael, it's always great to be back with you.
How are you holding up?
I'm doing great. We are going a million miles an hour, and we're having fun, and we're seeing a lot of energy, a lot of enthusiasm.
Well, you can't win a presidential election or even a nomination on Facebook likes, but even BuzzFeed, you probably haven't had a chance to see this yet, but BuzzFeed today says more than perhaps, now this is a site that does not like you, as you know, so that makes it even better. More than perhaps any other figure in American politics at the moment, Ted Cruz has proven himself to be a true blue native of the social web, and they declare you to be basically the most talked about presidential candidate on all of social media. Wow.
Well, I did see that article, and they were very kind. I went by BuzzFeed's offices yesterday and toured the office, took a picture with them, and they had a cardboard cutout of the most interesting man in the world. And so I pulled the cutout in, and we all took a picture together. And then I ended up auditioning for The Simpsons, and they put that video out today, which we had some fun with.
Well, you say in your new book, A Time for Truth, that President Bush in 2000, when you were a domestic policy advisor to his campaign, that he referred to, everybody has a nickname, and instead of calling you Ted, you were Theodore because you were so serious. See, you're showing you're not always so serious.
Oh, you got to have fun. You can't survive a campaign without having fun, without laughing and cutting up, and you and I have more than once had the opportunity to perhaps kill a few liver cells and laugh at the joy of life.
And that's what it's all about. Tomorrow, Wednesday, July 1st, from 10:30 to 1:30 at the Sam's Club on Rice Avenue, and in Katy from 3 to 5 at Books A Million. Let's talk about this book. There is there's a piece in there on one of my least favorite people in the world, Karl Rove, and you were running for Attorney General in 2009. I remember this. Jim Grace was all in. Everybody was excited. We thought Abbott wouldn't run for re-election. You go over to meet with President Bush 41, the elder, to get some advice, and you leave with an endorsement and a check, and Karl Rove loses his mind. Tell us about that, if you would.
Well, it was an incredible experience, and it was in the heat of the AG race, and I had the opportunity to spend the day with George and Barbara Bush up in Kennebunkport, which was just a magical experience. They were incredibly gracious and kind, and it brought me out on the boat with them. I'll tell you, President Bush 41, even well into his 80s, he drove the speedboat like he was still an 18-year-old fighter pilot, full speed, crashing into the water. And at the end of the afternoon, to my utter astonishment, he pulled out a check out of his pocket for $1,000 to my campaign for Attorney General from him and from Barbara. And I was, you know me well enough to know I'm rarely speechless. I was truly speechless. Called Heidi, said I just had the most magical day. And then fast forward 3 days later, and Karl Rove calls me on my cell phone. Now, I've known Karl a long time. I considered him a friend. But he was furious. He was yelling and cursing, and he was very, very upset that I had gotten the support for Bush 41. And it turns out that Karl was very active trying to raise money for the George W. Bush, the Bush 43 library. And there were a whole bunch of donors up in Dallas who were writing big checks, six-figure checks, seven-figure checks to the library. And they were ticked off that the Bush family was not supporting their guy. They were backing a state rep up there. And so Karl was just livid. And you know, I responded to him. I said, look, Karl, I'm just doing what your advice was. You said to go and try and build support. And he responded angrily, "Yeah, but I didn't think you'd get 41." And he said some unkind things, and then at that point I said, "Well, Karl, what do you want me to do?" He said, "Return the check." I said, "Well, I can't do that. I've already deposited it under the Texas Ethics Commission law. I have to report it." And he said, "Okay, fine. Then do nothing to draw attention to it. And he basically, that's when he pulled out the hammer and he said, if you do anything to draw attention to it, then he threatened implicitly that George W. Bush would come out and endorse my opponent, which I thought was pretty stunning, given that I'd spent 4 years of my life working for George W. Bush very hard to help him get elected in 2000 in his administration. But he gave that threat. I always wondered if Karl had the authority to give those threats or not. I didn't know. But I said, "All right, Karl, we'll do that." And about an hour later, we got the sign-off from Bush 41's office that he had approved an official endorsement statement. Michael, it was the most generous, kind, effusive endorsement statement. It really was humbling to receive it, and I called my team and said, "You know what? Let's throw it in the trash. We're not going to put out that the former president of the United States has endorsed me in an attorney general race, where that's a big deal." And I got to tell you, when I hung up the phone, my wife Heidi looked at me, and she was madder than I've ever seen her. She said, "You know, this is what's screwed up about the Republican Party. The race for Attorney General of Texas could turn on who the darn donors are to the Bush Library." And so that's a story I recount in the book, A Time for Truth. There are a whole lot more stories in the book just like that, of kind of the inside, what happens in politics, some of the seedy role, some of the role money plays, and also the incredible impact the grassroots can have overcoming that dynamic.
Does Karl Rove have too much influence on the Republican Party in America today?
Well, Karl is very talented, but I'm not sure he always uses his talent in the way that's the most beneficial. I describe in the book my trying to urge him that he could have a really positive impact on the party, but that his focus has not been as directed there as it should. Listen, I consider Karl a friend. When this book came out, he put out a statement 2 nights ago flatly denying everything I related about the incident, and it was a hard-hitting statement where he essentially said I was lying. And he said I wasn't raising money for the Bush Library. There was nothing to do with any state rep in Dallas. This is all made up. It's not true. I got to tell you, Michael, I've known Karl a long time. It never occurred to me that he would flat out deny it and issue a direct falsehood. And so in response, I released the email correspondence between me and Karl, where he says in writing in emails he signed that this was all about big donors in Dallas giving to the Bush Library who were backing this state rep potentially running against me for Attorney General. And it was
Senator
fairly
Cruz,
clear.
Can you hold with us for just a moment?
Sure.
We'll talk more about the book, A Time for Truth, the book's schedule and what it says, coming up next. Senator Ted Cruz is our guest. He is on an aggressive book tour. There'll be 2 signings tomorrow, one in Houston at the Sam's on Rice at 10:30 in the morning till, I think, 1:30. And then tomorrow afternoon in Katy at Books A Million. I've posted those to Facebook. We'll post them to the blog at michaelberry.com. You can see his entire schedule on there. In the book, Senator, there is a reference to you while a clerk to then Chief Justice Rehnquist watching porn. A most interesting story of how you bring real life to people who have to make rulings on real life but are quite distinct from it.
Well, that is one of the more fun stories in the book. When I just came out of law school, I was a law clerk for Chief Justice William Rehnquist, and at the time, it was one of the very first internet pornography cases that came to the court. And this is 1996. It was really when the internet was just starting to get going. And, you know, the justices are not exactly spring chickens. And at the time, they didn't really understand what this internet thing was. And so the court librarians decided to do a tutorial to show them what the internet was. And they paired 2 justices together and their clerks. So it so happened that Chief Justice Rehnquist and Sandra Day O'Connor and their clerks were paired together. And so it was the 2 justices, and it was 7 clerks, and we're all in this little bitty room, and the librarian is using a search engine and types in the word cantaloupe, misspelled even, and
Yes.
with the filters off, cantaloupe misspelled immediately brought in an array of graphic, hardcore pornography. And so I'm standing in a very little room, standing right behind Sandra Day O'Connor, which is a 26-year-old man with more than awkward to be watching porn with Justice O'Connor. And I still remember her comment when she saw the images. She just sort of squinted her eyes and under her breath said, "Oh my."
All right, so tell the truth. Did you know what the term meant prior to that moment?
I don't even know that I know what it means today. But I do know that at least in that time, if you search for it, it brought some pretty explicit things up.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Kind words from Alan Dershowitz, who has called you the brightest law student to ever come through his class. Since I'm guessing he doesn't share your politics, he goes up in my esteem for that.
Well, he was my criminal law professor in law school, and he and I disagree on a great many issues. But I'll tell you, he was a fantastic teacher. And it's interesting. He was actually a teacher who likes strong argument on the other side. He would be contemptuous of what he viewed as weak-minded liberals who would agree with him, but who couldn't give any reasoning. So if you'd have some liberal student who would raise his hand and say, well, I just feel this is the right answer, Dersh would respond, "No, you feel, do you? You're emoting. I'm sorry, I thought you were in law school. I thought you were learning to make an argument." And he and I became friends because, I tried in law school to be fairly restrained and not speak a whole lot in class. But he would start slamming, in particular Justice Scalia and Justice Thomas, and I'd get ticked off. And I'd raise my hand and say, now, hold on a second, Professor Dershowitz. And his eyes would light up, and we'd begin arguing, and he loved it if you could argue with him and actually hold your own. And half the time I'd go back to his office and spend a half hour finishing the argument with him in his office hours. And he has been a very kind friend. In fact, he ended up writing a recommendation for me when I clerked for Chief Justice Rehnquist, which I have to admit the Chief was completely flabbergasted on how on earth Alan Dershowitz was recommending me to clerk for him.
That might have been one of those old James A. Baker III lines, "I'll speak for you or against you, whichever will help you most." I'm not sure that helped you. Let's talk about the book, A Time for Truth, Senator Ted Cruz's new book. You talk in there about Mitch McConnell and The Hill. I don't know how much time you've had to read these things today, but The Hill talks about the fact that you're not going to be very popular in the Senate for revealing what you do, for instance, about the debt ceiling discussion.
Right.
Talk about that for a moment, if you would.
Well, the opening chapter of the book is called Mendacity. And what it does is it tries to bring the readers behind closed doors into what actually happens among Senate Republicans, the backdoor conversations concerning raising the debt ceiling. And you'll recall about a year ago when President Obama wanted trillions more in debt with no spending reforms, House leadership chose to give it to him. And Senate leadership asked every Republican to agree to affirmatively consent to lower the threshold to make it easier for Harry Reid and Barack Obama to add trillions to our debt. And the reasons that they said we should do that were that, number one, if we did, it would pass, and hallelujah, hallelujah, all of us really wanted that result. We wanted trillions more in debt with no spending reforms because we were afraid of the issue. But number two, they said, if we lower the threshold from 60 votes to 50 votes, then the Democrats have the votes to pass it on their own. We can all vote no, and we could go and tell our constituents we opposed what it was we just consented to allow happen. And Michael, as I was listening to that, I was astonished, and I raised my hand, and I said, listen, there's no universe in which I can affirmatively consent to do that. I spent 2 years campaigning across Texas telling Texans, if you elect me, I'll fight with every breath in my body to stop the spending and debt that's bankrupting our kids and grandkids. If I were to affirmatively consent to make it easier for Barack Obama and Harry Reid to add trillions in debt, I think that would be dishonest and unfaithful to the men and women who elected me. And there's nothing I've done in the Senate that has engendered more animosity, more vitriol, more attacks. And what I try to do in the book, A Time for Truth, is really bring the reader in and what's happening behind closed doors and describe how the Washington cartel works. The Washington cartel is a term I use for career politicians in both parties, Democrats and Republicans, who get in bed with lobbyists and giant corporations, and they're all unified in growing government, expanding spending, expanding debt, and it's why working men and women, our lives are getting harder and harder and harder. That's what this book, A Time for Truth, is trying to do, is really shine the light into what's happening in Washington.
I'll give everybody the details on the book tour after Senator Cruz leaves us. I've got a little more than a minute. Talk, if you would. You've been very outspoken, more than any other presidential candidate, against the Supreme Court's ruling on Friday. If you would, take to the end of the segment to discuss that.
I'm happy to do that. We saw last week two decisions back-to-back that were naked judicial activism. They were lawless. On Thursday, the U.S. Supreme Court rewrote Obamacare, ignored federal law in order to force that failed law on millions of Americans. And then on Friday, the Supreme Court violated the Constitution and purported to strike down the marriage laws adopted in all 50 states. Both decisions were completely lawless. They were wrong. Marriage has always been a question for the states. Marriage, the union of one man and one woman, has existed for millennia. Long before we had a United States of America, God ordained marriage as the union of one man and one woman. And I'll tell you, there have been a lot of Republicans, including a lot of Republican 2016 campaign candidates, who've come out with really tepid responses saying it's the law of the land, we have to accept it, we must surrender, we must move on. Michael, it is a sad thing when you see Republican presidential candidates reading Barack Obama's talking points, because that's exactly what he's saying from the Rose Garden. In my view, this is lawless. Every one of us should denounce it. I've introduced a constitutional amendment to protect the authority of state legislatures to define marriage as the union of one man and one woman. I've introduced legislation in the Senate stripping the federal courts of authority of jurisdiction over challenges to marriage. That's an explicit check the Constitution gives Congress to rein in an overreaching judiciary. And finally, I've called for a constitutional amendment to subject Supreme Court justices to periodic retention elections. 20 states do that. And if these justices are going to subvert our democracy, that's what Justice Scalia said they were doing. He said that five unelected lawyers...
I'm up against a hard break. Senator Ted Cruz, I'll give you all the details on his book tour coming up.